My next guest is a man who says he wants to be vice president, who says he's the only man in U.S. history to have made such an announcement. I'd like to welcome to the program Jim Jatras. Jim, thanks for being here.
Hi, Liz. Thank you very much.
All right, I want to talk about your vice presidential hopes in just a second, but first, let's touch on Syria. So the peace talks began there last week, but the situation looks pretty bad over there, Jim.
It does, and I don't expect much from these talks in terms of getting to a political settlement, even though the Western powers and our regional allies like Saudi Arabia and Turkey have seemingly dropped the a priori insistence that Assad must go. It's still clear that we want that to be the outcome of these talks, even as that becomes less and less likely with the Russian intervention on the side of the Assad government. And we also have the Saudis and the Turks doubling down in their support for jihad groups in Syria. And I was very disturbed to see Vice President Biden in Turkey last week essentially cooperating with the Turks, who are not directed against ISIS, but against the Kurds, who have been among the most effective fighters against ISIS.
Now, these peace talks, as you mentioned, they're supposed to last 6 months. The goal is a ceasefire or a political settlement. You say you don't expect a political settlement to come from them. What do you expect to be the case in 6 months from now?
Well, I hope at the least they can start to make some agreements, maybe on a local basis, for providing humanitarian assistance to the people who are suffering there, and maybe move toward a localized or even a general ceasefire. But even that's going to be a very tall order, and also, frankly, an invitation for one side or the other to commit provocations that they then can blame on the other side.
All right, talk to me about the humanitarian aspect that you're talking about, because these talks were initially scheduled to begin before they did, and there was a delay because the main opposition bloc had an issue with the humanitarian aspect. What does that mean?
What it means is, first off, that there's not much credibility to the opposition bloc. Obviously, ISIS is not there. We don't want them there. Al-Nusra, which is part of Al-Qaeda, is not there, and we don't want them there. But that means that there's really nobody on the opposition side who can speak with authority as a serious, credible military force on the ground. So when you start talking about things like humanitarian relief, who can really make a deal that would actually have some prospect of sticking? And the answer is not clear.
All right, let's go back to something that you said right at the beginning, and you talked about Russia becoming a problem, their participation being a problem. Now, they've supported the inclusion of 2 main opposition groups in these negotiations, both of which are hardline supporters of radical Islamic activity. Is that wise to include those 2 groups in negotiations like this?
It probably isn't, but oddly enough, I think it's something of a concession on the Russian side. The Russians up till now have taken the position that as far as they're concerned, all the armed groups fighting against the Damascus government are terrorists, end of discussion. But when the Saudis in particular insist that this fellow Aloush with the Army of Islam must head the delegation, what are the Russians going to say at that point? If they turn that down, then they don't have anybody sitting on the opposite side of the table from the government. So I think it's something that probably was rather unavoidable from their point of view.
All right, I want to switch topics here for a moment and talk about some issues we face in our country in regards to radical Islamic activity. Now, you say that most Americans probably assume that Muslims who enter our country, and this topic has been brought up a lot during this presidential primary by Donald Trump, and then that sparked discussion across the board. But you say Americans probably assume that Muslims who enter our country are vetted for ties to radical Islamic organizations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood or any other ties that would want to establish a caliphate. Now, you say that not only is this not the case, they're not vetted, it's worse than that. Tell us what you mean by that.
Under current practice, if you want to bar somebody for connections to terrorism, you have to demonstrate politically motivated violence. Now, that might be fine if we're dealing with the Irish Republican Army or the Tamil Tigers or something. But when we're talking about jihad ideology, radical Islam, we need to be talking about what is it these people are trying to accomplish. Imposition of Sharia law, creation of a caliphate. This is the kind of law that stones adulteresses, kills apostates, and so forth. Well, you can peacefully advocate those things all you want. You can be part of an organization like the Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb ut-Tahrir that advocates these things, and that is not a bar to your coming into the United States. Now, up until 1990, we had ideological bars from people coming into the country, Nazis, communists, anarchists, and so forth. And I think it's time to reinstate that kind of criteria for people who advocate these very unconstitutional and un-American practices. That's why, by the way, I'll be posting a petition on the White House website this week to call for the reintroduction of those kind of standards for radical Islam, and people can check out my Twitter feed to get updates on that.
Right, so it's not religious-based so much as it is ideology-based. And I think you're right. Historically, our country has allowed people to come to America who want to be Americans, who want to be part of our nation, how it is, the principles that we hold. Not in the religious sense, but in the sense that every person is endowed with the right to freedom, and that people who want to come to our country, celebrate and participate in those values are welcome, and people who don't want to aren't welcome. You talk about this petition that you're going to post on the White House. What would have to happen for this criteria to change, for us to allow people who need to escape government oppression to come here, but not those who actively support radical groups? Is that a legislative motion that needs to be made?
Preferably, it could be done through legislation and probably should be. However, the president does have authority under existing law to bar any class of aliens he deems detrimental to the American interest from entering the United States under any conditions that he might propose. So I think he has the legal authority to do this, and I think you're right on point. Religion should not be used as a cover for what amounts to political advocacy. We are under no obligation to let people come in and politically advocate abolishing our constitutional standards or the values that we hold dear as Americans.
All right, Jim, I mentioned this in my intro, and I want to ask you about this. You say you want to be vice president, not president. You want to be vice president. That's obviously not an office you can run for independently. Why do you think you'd be a good vice president?
Well, a few things. I've been around Washington for 35 years in both the legislative and executive branches. I served for over 17 years at the U.S. Senate. To start with, other than not dying, the only constitutional responsibility of the vice president is to preside over the Senate, which is something no vice president has ever taken seriously. So I think I could be very helpful to the next Republican president in that regard. There's also knowing how things work, where the bodies are buried, and frankly, who are the people you need to stay away from who will try to glom onto you.
So what's your platform? Where do you fall on the political spectrum in relation to the candidates that are running for president now?
Well, I think I'm pretty solid conservative, pro-life, pro-gun. I am against some of these trade deals that I think have been detrimental to American jobs. I think we need to be more careful on our foreign policy in terms of where our interests are involved and how we protect the safety and prosperity of Americans. I do think we need to do something about immigration control. So I think that's becoming more and more the mainstream of the Republican Party. I think it is definitely on the conservative side of the party, though.
All right, you said that the responsibility of the vice president is essentially just not to die and to preside over the Senate, rather. What would you want your role to be if you don't want to be just a figurehead?
Well, I think that it's very important that the next Republican president be able to move his legislation on Capitol Hill. And, you know, we have this little myth going on that somehow there's this filibuster in the Senate that prevents legislation moving there. I actually issued a paper on this a few months ago that the real problem isn't the filibuster, which doesn't really exist anymore. It's something called cloture, which is a legal mechanism for cutting off debate. What I think we really need is to return to the old-fashioned filibuster, that if a minority wants to block legislation, they have to actually get out on the floor and do it, not just rely on a 40-vote margin. So I think there are some reforms that I could be quite helpful with and would help the next Republican administration to be a real success.
All right, we're almost out of time, but one last question, and this is the fun one, Jim. Who do you want to be your chief executive?
You know, I'm going to keep my powder dry on that, Liz, for the time being. When I announced my interest, I wanted to specifically say not I want to be this guy or that guy's vice president, but the Republican nominee for vice president. And let's wait and see who comes out on top. I think this vetting process is actually good for our country and good for our party. I think actually Reince Priebus, the chairman of the party, is doing a very good job at letting the candidates have their say. Let's let that process play out. And when the top person emerges, I'll be ready. All
right, Jim, I'll let it slide today, but I'm going to keep pressing you on that as you continue to come back. I appreciate